Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here. It is time for the final series of the NACL Spring Split. It is finals time, championship time, if you will, in the spring split. Here, only 2 teams remain. We've gone over every single game that's happened in the NACL up until this point this year, every single regular season game, every single playoff game leading into this. So it's all led up to these 2 teams duking it out to see who will be considered the spring split champions. Now, I know this is looked at a little bit differently because the spring split doesn't necessarily do anything for these NACL teams, but still being able to say, like, I won tier 2, I'm the top, player in my role, or I'm on the top team in tier 2, giving yourself that kind of confidence going into a summer split where you can potentially try and qualify for the LTA is massive. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below what you expected from this series. Did it live up to your expectations, and were you surprised by the outcome? Of course, I'm going to kind of preview this series before we get into everything because it's a little bit of a different format today with only 1 series to cover. We're going to be going game by game rather than series by series, of course, and so we're going to have a lot of in-depth, analysis to kind of give on these performances, but we'll definitely give my thoughts in this video, and I want to hear yours down in the comment section below. But without further ado, let's get into it. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go game by game in the finals, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each game that we cover, and at the end of the series, I will be giving a player of the series or a finals MVP to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. Nothing to preview, nothing to talk about. The spring split will technically be over after this. I think, I guess technically we probably have the promotion tournament. I think that technically counts towards the spring split. Maybe it counts towards the summer split. I don't really know how that ends up working out, but really in terms of the NACL, this is the final series of the first half of the year. So without further ado, let's actually get into the analysis of these games and of these teams. Obviously, this is a rematch of winners finals in terms of how things went down there. These are clearly the 2 best teams in the NACL, at least in my opinion. It's the number 2 seeded Luminosity Gaming taking on the number 1 seeded DarkZero Dragonsteel, and the reason I feel so confident talking about these 2 teams as the best in the NACL, despite the fact that Dragonsteel actually had some ups and downs here, having to go to 5 games against a team like Conviction and kind of being blown out, maybe not blown out. They win game 1 against Luminosity in winners finals and then get kind of trashed in games 2, 3, and 4. The reason I feel so confident in still saying that these are the 2 best teams is because this looked like a completely different DarkZero Dragonsteel team the moment that they, took Shimmer out. And credit to Shimmer. I really like him as a player. I think he has a ton of upside at this level, but he's barely played in tier 2. He was being asked to fill a very, very gigantic void for Yuji in this team, and he just wasn't ready to do that. But Kryra coming in, obviously the starting jungler for the sibling team, if you want to call that, the second team here on DarkZero, which was DarkZero Light. Him coming in as the starting jungler for them in their playoff run immediately showed a completely different side of this team, and they looked phenomenal with him in as the starting jungler, and that's what gives me the confidence to say that DarkZero Dragonsteel is very much within their realm in the finals. They deserve their spot in top 2, but I think really for the first time this year, this organization is going into a series as the underdogs. I know you could definitely say that that was the case in winners finals, but I wasn't so sure about that, at least in the same way that every other analyst seemed to be sure about that. I really thought that it was going to be a lot closer than it ended up being. I had a lot of faith that this team, even without Yuji, was going to be able to make some pretty big plays and to be able to push a team like Luminosity, and I had them as favorites going into that series. That obviously did not end up working out, but this is the first time I've gone into a best of 5 personally with DarkZero Dragonsteel and expected them to lose, or at least predicted them to lose, and so them coming in as underdogs is definitely a bit of a different story for them, but I think it might even be helpful in a couple of different ways. First and foremost, you arguably have the best solo lane duo of any team in the NACL. Zamudo has been absolutely on fire across this year. Sometimes he can ego himself out of good situations. Things like Nidalee can pop out every once in a while where he's picking it into these very aggressive lanes, or even more passive lanes. Like he'll pick it blind and then the enemy will pick something like Ornn and he'll not be able to function nearly as well as maybe he would want to. He can kind of get himself into trouble in that regard. But in terms of actual gameplay, like taking the mental aspect out of it, Zamudo has been incredible throughout 2025, and I think that that has been a really big positive. He's been the best player player on this team. I don't even think it's really been all that close. And Spyrax has been incredible across this year as well. I think if he had played the full split, there would probably have been a real conversation about first team All-Pro for the mid lane. Pobelter ends up getting it pretty easily for me because Spyrax ends up missing quite a few games with them swapping in and out of their like two rosters, their DarkZero Storm and their DarkZero Light. But Spyrax has been incredible. I would argue that as a carry, as a player who's going to step up and be a primary resource getter, this has been one of his better years in the NACL, better splits, I should say, in the NACL throughout his entire career. And this has already been somebody who's near the top of the NACL mid lane leaderboard. Sajed and Zyko have been really solid also as primary carry options. Zyko has been incredible throughout this playoff run, but he wasn't very good last time they played Luminosity. Zeyzal definitely got the better of him in terms of how the support matchup ended up going, and I thought that that was a pretty big deal. Sajed has been very consistent for this team, but has never really shown the ability to elevate a team to championship, caliber gameplay, at least in tier 2. So this is going to be a big challenge for them going up against Tactical and Zeyzal, very experienced players on the other side, and that really brings us to Kryra in the jungle, doesn't it? Because if he can step up and play like he did in games 4 and 5 against Conviction, that's a completely different team than what we saw out of DarkZero in games 1 to 3 against Conviction and the entire series against Luminosity. If that's the version that we are going to get, I think things are going to be a lot more competitive, and that's why I predicted that things would be a lot more competitive. But Luminosity are absolutely still favorites going into this series. Do not get it twisted. It would be an upset if they did not end up taking this, and so let's talk about why. Like, what is working for them? Well, they have some of the best players in the entire league. Tactical has been as incredible as advertised, as good as anybody could have expected him to be. This was already a player who was in a really unfortunate situation in Tier 1, where he was kind of stuck on a bad team for quite a few years and, was playing well on that bad team, but didn't really get to ever, prove anything because he was the number 1 and only option on an Immortals team that had no other talent surrounding him. So he goes down to Tier 2 here, and he's been everything that you could ask for and then some. And the reason I say and then some is because I've really stressed throughout this year how flexible Tactical has been. Typically speaking, he's somebody who wants a lot of resources and can be a bit detrimental because he's so greedy and aggressive in a couple of spots if he's not getting those resources. That's not really been the case. He's been a lot better as a weak side AD carry this year, which I think has added a layer for Luminosity to be able to play through other lanes. Zeyzal has also been incredible over the past couple of series. I think you could even argue that over the last 2-3 weeks, like the playoffs and then the end of the regular season, like Zeyzal's been the best player on Luminosity. That's how he's been able to step up. I don't think he was quite there at any point before that in the split, but at least in recent memory, like, he has been incredible. Definitely outplayed Zyko the last time these two teams played. Insanity and Tomio are really starting to click again. Insanity, another player who I think is playing his best league of the year at the current moment. Tomio's always been a very good player, and Fake God's had a great split. There's really nothing to complain about for him on the top side. Luminosity have a lot of pieces going for them, and remember, all of these players are significantly more experienced than players like Kryra on the other side of this. Even Sajed, who has had success at this level, it's not really been in the same kind of ecosystem. He was in a North American, an LCS affiliated organization last year in FlyQuest. This is a completely different beast, and for players like Fake God and Tomio, Insanity, Tactical, who's been to Worlds, Zeyzal, who's been to World semifinals, these are players who have reached the mountaintop of their own profession and have experienced situations far more stressful than this one. I have a feeling they're going to step up today. Can DarkZero match that aggression? My prediction was Luminosity 3-2. I felt like this was going to go all 5 games. We'll see if I end up being correct there, but the only way to know is to go game by game, and that means starting with game number 1. So let's go ahead and get into it. The winner of game number 1 was Luminosity Gaming. They are going to take game number 1. They're going to go up in this series 1-0. And this was as good of a game 1 as I think you could possibly ask for from them. This was super clinical. DarkZero really had no answer to the draft that was put out on the side of Luminosity. If you're unfamiliar with the game-by-game format, I'm going to go a bit deeper into draft in terms of how these two ended up stacking out, at least from my perspective, and then talk about where I think things went right, where I think things went wrong for each of their drafts, and then, of course, for gameplay, what were the things that ended up getting out of control, and what does that mean for the series going forward. I try to keep these a little bit shorter, but you guys know me. I ramble. I talk a lot. That's my whole thing here on this channel, is I do a lot of yapping, and so sometimes I go a bit over the 5 to 6 minute marker that I try to set for myself on a game-to-game basis. But starting off here in game number 1, let's go ahead and talk about those drafts that got Luminosity a victory. I think theirs is just a little bit more clear in terms of the intention. DarkZero clearly want to quote-unquote scale into this game, and the reason I put quotes around that is because I really don't think that this is a comp that is super successful in the later part of the game unless that they are completely neutral, like either ahead or neutral, which is pretty difficult to do. Kryra has a lot of responsibility in this game on the Xin Zhao to actually generate tempo, because Sion and Vladimir aren't going to be able to do that at all in their solo lanes. In fact, the solo lanes are not very positive overall for this team. Like, the Yorick's not going to be able to dominate Sion in any conceivable way, but, you know, I think the Vladimir loses to the Ahri. Ahri certainly is going to be able to get shoved and have more pressure in the mid game where she can find a lot of those picks, and the Varus is not going to be able to push up, or Rakan in that same way, against the Kalista Renata. That's why it was such a strong pick at the end of the draft, and Luminosity are going to have all the tempo because of that. Does Luminosity scale? No, not particularly well at all. You're looking at a team fight in the late game that theoretically is a 4-1 with Yorick split pushing in the side lane, and your biggest damage threat is a Kalista, maybe an Ahri if she gets super fed. That's not really a great place to be if you want to try and take down a Vladimir who's going to get very tanky, or a Varus who's going to be able to free hit on the backline. But the problem is, neither of these drafts really have a ton of ways to, you know, control the late game, and that means the one that controls the mid game is actually in a great spot, and that's going to be Luminosity, that's going to be the Vi Ahri, that's going to be Kalista pushing forward, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Insanity is going to get my player of the game here. I think there are a couple of really interesting things to talk about in terms of how Luminosity in particular wanted to play this out. A couple of really nice interactions, but Insanity's charms and just his raw damage, quite frankly, at the back end of a lot of these fights, that's really what separated Luminosity for me. You can kind of break down the really, you know, smart and nice plays that players like Tomio or Fake God ended up making in terms of like canceling teleports or keeping Sion occupied in a side lane. Like, all of that is super important, and I do think that those things contributed to Luminosity's success and their win in this game. But if you don't have Insanity cleaning up on a lot of these plays, I think things do become a lot more difficult. We talk about the lack of consistent damage outside of a fed Kalista in this game, but Insanity was incredible on the Ahri, and I think why that's so important is because he's not been, you know, the Insanity that we kind of know throughout 2025, at least in my opinion. I think a lot of people have been talking, I've seen a lot of people throughout the name of Insanity when talking about a potential Shopify Rebellion mid laner with Palafox not playing particularly well right now. The reason that I kind of have pushed back on that is because I haven't really seen Insanity do all that much on this team. Like, his numbers look pretty good, and in the 1v1s he's been solid, but in terms of importance towards their success, there are very few games you can point to this split and be like, yeah, Insanity is kind of what put them over the top. I think most mid laners are probably winning on this team in terms of how things go, and Insanity's not really been the guy that's jumped out to me, at least more so than anybody else on this team, but we know he has the talent to do so. This is a guy who I've praised a ton in the past. I gave him a freaking All-Pro nod in 2023, was that? The last year on TSM? I gave him an All-Pro nod in that instance, because I think him stepping in and being as good as he was for that roster was like gigantic, and he actually was very, very good in tier 1. So I'm certainly not a person who's going to sit here and be shocked by the fact that Insanity can step up and really perform well at the tier 2 level. It's just nice to see that this team can put their eggs in his basket and he actually can pay them back out, which is, again, something that hasn't always been shown off throughout the entirety of this split. I think the rest of this team is great. Tomio had a phenomenal game on the Vi. This is just one of those Vi Ahri games where you have pressure everywhere, where your mid game is so much better than the enemies because they don't really have anything outside of a potential Xin Zhao skirmish that can really create a lot. Like, Rakan can do things, but Rakan was never going to be able to survive some of the engages that were happening throughout this game. You were picking on Vladimir in the mid lane. Like, it was just very difficult for DarkZero to end up playing out the mid game, and I think part of that is how well Tomio played off of not only Insanity, but his lanes winning, and that kind of transitions nicely into Tactical and Zeyzal down in the bot lane. Like I said, they've been on fire as of late, the best lane for Luminosity throughout the playoffs, and that carried over here in game number 1. They mega gapped Sajed and Zyko early on, as is to be expected in the Kalista versus Varus matchup, and then they continued to be big nuisances in the later part of the game. Fake God with a couple of really nice, you know, interaction plays, and generally the York was just a nuisance throughout the entire game, which is kind of the benefit of the champion, but Luminosity just performed better. I think it's pretty easy to say that. Was their comp easier to execute? Absolutely. Is there a way to throw this game? 100%, and they did not go out and do that. And then for Dragonsteel on the other side, some real big negative plays to talk about. Maybe this is going to be controversial, but dud of the game for me is going to go to Spyrax in the mid lane. I was not impressed at all by the Vladimir play in game number 1. I really just think that this champion should not be a game 1 pick. I certainly don't think this is the answer to Ahri. I don't really know what you're going for with the Xin Zhao Vladimir like mid jungle duo. I think in theory it can work, and I understand the safety and the protection it offers, the scaling that it could theoretically offer a team that wants to play around its carry duo later. But if you're going to do that and you're going to use the Vladimir to try and stay safe against this Vi Ahri combo that can really take over the early game, because that's what Luminosity is indexing in, then why are we investing into things like Xin Zhao in the draft, and why are we drafting Rakan on R5? Like, it just raises a few more question marks to me. And on top of that, I don't think Spyrex played well at all. I think there were a lot of times where he did get caught out in the mid lane, where the Vi Ahri ganks actually did, really affect his gameplay and really put him behind in a lot of instances. And he wasn't the only one who felt that, but I think if you're going to draft the Vlad, you got to be able to make it work, and I just don't think it did in this game. Kryra did not look nearly as aggressive as he did in the previous series against Conviction. I know going into Tomio was certainly different than going into Kisno. It's not quite the same thing, but Kryra is going to need to be the player that really steps up here today. He needs to be a finals caliber jungler in order for this to work. I think he can be, but this was not a great showing on the Xin Zhao. Sajed and Zyko got blasted. Sajed did nothing throughout this game. I think he did like 7,000 or 8,000 damage. Like, he was not a champion. If you want to give dead of the game to Sajed, I totally understand, because he was completely irrelevant. Zyko could never really get any sort of engage off, and Zamudo was stuck on the top side catching the Yorick. And overall, it was just a bad game 1 from Dragonsteel, and it was kind of reminiscent of what happened in games 2, 3, and 4 between these two teams in winners finals. And so that's a really bad sign for Dragonsteel. They need to be able to turn things around. Dropping 0-2 to Luminosity is basically a death sentence. So super important game 2. If Luminosity can get that 2-0 lead, boy, are they going to be looking good moving forward with how well they've looked in the recent weeks. Is that going to happen, or is DarkZero going to be able to tie up our series and create a series situation where both teams have as equal of a chance of winning and, keep their hopes and dreams alive? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Luminosity Gaming. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and they are going to take full control of their own destiny, as they are now on series point, 1 win away from becoming your 2025 NACL Spring Split champions. And DarkZero Dragonsteel are now 1 loss away from getting swept out of the finals, from going backwards from what they were in the winners finals, where they already felt like they were behind the curve. It really would be a disastrous scenario for Dragonsteel if that ended up happening, but this is huge for Luminosity, and I still think that there are a couple of things to talk about in terms of how this went down that were completely avoidable. Right now, there are some positives, but some negatives for DarkZero. I think some of that is the drafting. I think some of that is the gameplay, and, everything in between, right? Like, I know we're going to touch upon everything, but right now, it doesn't really feel like they're, all that close. They picked up no towers in this game, and they only got 1 in game number 1. Like, outside of the 3 Void Grubs, and I think 1 tower in game 1, they've been able to get no objectives throughout the first 2 games of this series. It's just been a nightmare for them. So we'll go ahead and talk about it here. Of course, starting with the draft and kind of talking about where my thoughts were after this draft. I think both of these comps clearly do want to play for late game, at least in different kinds of ways. When you draft things like Sejuani, Gwen, like, that does point to me that at least late game is on the menu, and specifically because I don't think your mid game is particularly good. Trying to fight around a Lucian, Tristana, I just don't know how consistent that's going to be. I think that's the idea for DarkZero Dragonsteel, but Luminosity have the Wombo comp to end all Wombo comps. You've got Orianna Shockwave, you've got Misfortune Bullet Time, you've got Rumble Equalizer, you've got so many big teamfight ultimates that can be layered down, and you also have a lot of ways to play front to back. You've got a lot of protection in this comp coming from things like the Nautilus and the Trundle, even the Orianna itself being able to throw the shield onto a couple of members, and so I like their ability to scale into the late game as well, and I like their individual matchups. I think Rumble has always, to me, been preferable in the Gwen matchup. I've had some conversations with some good analysts about this, but I really do think that Rumble scales just as well as Gwen, even if I don't think that his innate combat power is higher. I think Gwen's innate combat power is higher, but I think Rumble is so useful, like, in team fights. Like, it's so easy to be able to make Rumble useful in team fights that his effective combat power ends up being pretty equal, even if his, like, raw combat power isn't as high as Gwen's in the 1v1 or anything like that, in my opinion. And I think you look at something like Orianna just being able to scale super effortlessly in this. Orianna has a great matchup into Tristana. Like, there's really no problems with that. Kryra spent a lot of time in the mid lane trying to, pressure things out, but Spyrex lost really hard, kind of expectedly hard in this matchup, and then Insanity scales incredibly well. Orianna is gigantic in terms of how these two comps go up against each other, and basically all of that ended up playing out. So, we'll kind of talk about the execution part of it now. Insanity is going to get player of the game once again here in game number 2, certainly making a very strong case to be considered for finals MVP. No spoiler for the end of this series. We don't even know if they're going to be able to pick it up. If DarkZero can come back and win 3 games in a row, I can promise you Insanity is not winning finals MVP in that particular instance, but he has been incredible through the first 2 games, like, genuinely exceptional. Now, this game, I do think it's set up a tad bit more than maybe it was in game 1. Not that his matchup in game 1 was bad. The Ahri is still very important towards how that Vi Ahri comp, Callista comp ends up working out, but the Orianna here can just do everything. It can win early and establish pressure. It can delay the game in the mid game, not really allow Trist or Lucian to be able to skirmish in the way that they want, and it can be both the primary damage dealer and the setup for this big wombo ultimate, combo potential, or it can be a protector in the late game if you want to try to play through a Misfortune or a Rumble who have a lot of gold. Whatever the case ends up being, this Ori is always going to be useful in this game, and Insanity, quite frankly, just completely outplayed Spyrax to be able to get there, which is already super impressive. Again, even though it's a good matchup, we shouldn't just say, oh, it was a good matchup and he won it. Like, if you're going to win it as hard as Insanity was able to win this, that's a player diff. That's not just a matchup diff, especially with Kryra being so active in the game, dropping so many camps to try and facilitate his solo laners to be in even a neutral spot. It just did not happen here. Big credit to Insanity. He's been unreal so far in the finals. And I think you can credit a lot of the other players as well. The top side of the map in general has been super positive. Not to say that Tactical and Zeyzal have been any sort of a weak link. They've been incredible, but specifically the top side of the map has looked great. Tomio was awesome in this game on the Trundle. I've really come around to the Trundle jungle pick. I was really not a fan of this when it reappeared in the meta, like a month or two ago, and kind of really started to catch on in terms of popularity again. I think that there are times to utilize it. This is definitely a very good Trundle game in terms of being able to pull it out, and Sejuani's a great opponent for that. Something like Braum on the other side, even Gwen, I think makes a lot of sense to be able to try and interrupt a lot of what she wants to do. Lucian and Trist are basically going to have to burn their movement just to stay safe from Trundle, and Trundle himself has a lot of protection tools if you want to play front to back, and Tomio obviously played the map really well. He's always done that at a very high level. This is a guy who plays these, I don't want to say facilitators because Trundle can do more than that, but he plays those champions at an incredibly high level, and we saw that here. Fake God has been awesome so far, just outplayed Zamudo. Zamudo was super aggressive in these team fights, often going in without the rest of his team. That did not end up working out. Again, we'll talk about that, but Fake God kind of the capitalizer in those instances. Tactical and Zeyzal were definitely the players that were more so in the background of this game. Tactical maybe not so much, a couple of great bullet times, but Zeyzal definitely more setup in this game, having to die a lot of the time to keep the rest of his team safe. But for the most part, if you're going to do that and your Orianna and your Trundle and your Rumble and your Misfortune are all going to have the chance to pop off because that's what's happening, then you're absolutely doing your job as Nautilus. So, big ups to Luminosity. They look incredible so far. They look easily like the best team in the NACL through these first two games, and quite frankly, DarkZero has just not had any sort of answer to what Luminosity is putting out there in these first couple of games. I do want to give credit to Kryra. I think he is the one player that's actually attempting to do something throughout this game. He sacked camp after camp after camp to try to make sure that his laners were in an okay spot, and typically with the game state that you're in, I would be like, that's perfect. That's exactly what you should be doing. You're Sejuani. You don't really need to be the one to step up and be this gigantic mega tank in the back half of the game. You need to make sure Gwen or Tristana, or specifically one of those two, but I guess Lucian, like one of your lanes has to have gold. Like somewhere you have to be able to generate pressure, but the problem was the moment he wasn't there, his laners would just start losing again. Like they just got blasted in terms of their individual 1v1s, specifically mid lane, and that is a gigantic problem. And then you look at the team fights, and Zamudo's going in with nobody else around him, and he's getting killed first in every fight, and then Spyrax jumps in, basically seeing Zamudo die and saying, I want a piece of that cake too, and then he goes in and dies in every single fight, and there's nothing you can do as Kryra, as the Sejuani in that instance, to actually help your team, which is really unfortunate. And I think whoever you wanted to give dead of the game to out of Zamudo or Spyrax is kind of up to you, because both of them were bad. I think Zamudo was worse in these team fights on the Gwen, specifically because I think this champion should be doing more. Obviously, Gwen is very good at scaling into the late game and being a dangerous threat to actually, win a lot of these fights, but Zamudo was not piloting it well. I think this is one of his weaker games of the entire year, and that kind of showcased itself. But Spyrax has also just been getting blasted in the 1v1 mid lane. Insanity very much has his number in terms of the mechanics right now in the early game, and that is a big problem. Sajed and Zyko, once again, were just completely irrelevant throughout this game. Sajed was maybe more relevant in this than he was in game one on the Varus, where he was just completely out of every single play and was, doing 7,000 damage throughout the game. The Lucian was definitely doing a bit more here, but like, how much can the Lucian actually do? Zyko's job in this game was to try and protect carries. There were no carries. Your one carry in Zamudo was diving into the backline by himself and dying. Like, there's just nothing to do for DarkZero, and specifically for the bot lane in this one, and they're now down 0-2 in this series. It is looking disastrous for this team. If they cannot pick up this win, if they get swept out of the finals, then all of that hype around them being a potential upper tier team is going to dissipate very quickly, and all of it is going to transition to Luminosity Gaming, who right now are on the cusp of being a team that looks to dominate the top of the NACL standings. Are they going to be able to get it done in a 3-0 sweep, or is DarkZero going to stay alive at the very least for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Luminosity Gaming, they are going to take game number 3. They are going to take this series in a clean 3-0 sweep, and your 2025 NACL Spring Split champions are going to be Luminosity Gaming. I'm so happy, so proud of this team, because I think there's a lot of things you can talk about in a way where it's like, I didn't think they were going to be champions going into the year. I had them number 2, and I've never moved them from number 2 in my power rankings. Yes, they were favorited coming into this, but only because they had recently beaten DarkZero, and I thought DarkZero was better moving into the finals than they were in that winners finals. I thought there was a very real shot that they ended up turning things around, but instead of going backwards, they ended up dominating even more so. This was the closest game of the series. You can see that in some of the stats, but if this is the closest game of all 3 of these, that's absolutely ridiculous from Luminosity. It just goes to show how much further this team is along right now than they were even just, a couple of weeks ago, or going back to the end of the regular season, going back to the first time that these two teams played off when UG was still in the starting lineup. The way that Luminosity played today, I'm not sure it even really mattered. Kryra was totally fine for this team. Where they outclassed DarkZero was in the solo lane. Spyrax was not good enough, Zamudo was not good enough, and specifically, Insanity was incredible. Easy choice again for player of the game in game 3, and he's getting finals MVP. I'm gonna spoil it. He got player of the game for all 3 games. At least for me, he did. I don't even think this is a competition. There's nobody else on the team that did what Insanity did today in the mid lane, and for him to be the player that I've talked about the least over the course of this split, Fake God really popping off at the start, Tomio being hyper consistent, and a big piece throughout the entirety of the split, and Tactical and Zazel really coming along at the end. Zazel in particular really starting to step up. Insanity was the one to kind of blend into the background in terms of a lot of the analysis, but that did not carry over here to the finals. This was a fantastic performance, one of the best he's ever had. Like, even going back to his time in the Dignitas system, going back to his Immortals days, 100 Next days, I can rarely remember a series where Insanity played quite as well as he did here today in all 3 games. It was just exceptionally great stuff. He mega gapped Spyrax in this matchup, and that's really the big differentiating factor. A lot of people have been talking about him getting a tier 1 spot, like he should be in the LTA or something like that. This was definitely proof of that, and honestly, with the way that they're playing, he might be able to do it with this organization rather than having to wait for anything else. So obviously, we'll get into game 3. I just couldn't help myself. I had to talk about Insanity first and foremost. He was just so good in this series that I had to talk about him even before draft came in. But this is a very weird draft overall. This is kind of a Caitlyn draft in general for Luminosity, not in the fact that Caitlyn's the main character or anything, or the only champion that can do anything, but I think every draft that has a Caitlyn ends up playing pretty similarly, where you don't really want to ever fight in the mid game. You're really strong early and you're really strong late. You want to play for the 5v5s if you aren't able to get gigantic leads in the early game, and the 5v5s were decently solid. The problem is that they still won in the mid game. You still had Caitlyn getting a lot of gold, and Hui was doing so much damage on the back end of basically every single skirmish that ended up happening. It just ended up being a problem overall for DarkZero that they couldn't answer. That mid game is supposed to be where their strength is, with Ryze realm warping across the map and Jhin out damaging Caitlyn in that phase of the game. Even the Ambessa really still being relevant in that stage, but just didn't end up working out like that. Insanity was a little bit too strong, but I do want to give credit to everybody else on this team. You don't blow out a team like DarkZero if you're only winning in the mid lane. I just think Insanity definitely deserved the biggest shout out. I really want to talk about Fake God, because I think he's going to go a bit under the radar for this series. He was really, really solid. He was way better than Zamudo, who everybody kind of voted for most valuable prospect in terms of this split. As you guys know, I didn't really go for the Zamudo or Spyrax spread. I didn't go for any of the DarkZero players because they didn't play the entire split. It's hard to be considered the most valuable when you took a couple of games off, and that's not necessarily their fault. I know they wanted to rotate in a couple of other members, but, Fake God coming out and showing him, hey, I'm still the top laner to beat in terms of tier 2 in North America, and I get it. Fake God's tenures in tier 1 have not been great. I'm a big Fake God defender. I was really pushing for him in 2023 before he went back to Shopify Rebellion and got another shot there, because I thought the Dignitas tenure wasn't fair. I thought the 100 Thieves tenure wasn't particularly fair overall for him, and unfortunately it didn't work out last year, but every experience lets you grow more so as a player, and right now he still is arguably the #1 top laner here in tier 2. Again, he just outclassed Zamudo here today. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. Tactical was arguably the best player in the entire league. I think if you're looking at somebody in this matchup that should have won MVP, it's probably tactical. That's how good he was throughout this split. Again, I've hyped up his versatility, but you want to ask him to carry, he can still do that at a ridiculously high level. Really great late game team fighting. And then, of course, Zeyzal in the support position. What a playoff run from him. He was incredible in their best of fives, and he's the primary voice of this team. When you talk about this team having really good macro, obviously you got to give a lot of credit to the coaching staff, but Zeyzal is just as much a part of that as anybody else, with the way that he's basically an on-the-rift coach. And when his hands started to step up, like, that's an undefeated combo. If you're going to be a top-tier macro threat and shot caller, and you're going to be able to be a gigantic playmaker, that's core JJ in the LTA, so Zeyzal obviously really showing up. And Tomio, if he's the player I'm talking about last, like the creation on the Skarner here, but just generally the entire split, the consistency, the game in, game out positivity that he's able to show. This guy was a super hyped prospect. I was honestly super frustrated last year that he wasn't given an immediate starting spot over Boogie on Shopify Rebellion. Obviously, things, again, didn't really work out for him, but he didn't have a ton of time to get his feet under him at the Tier 1 level. He continues to dominate Tier 2, and I would love to see him in Tier 1 once again. For Luminosity, they're just incredible. Like, obviously, they're the favorites. I wish they got more out of winning the split here because they deserve it. They were incredible in this playoff run, but for now, they're just going to have to settle for being the team to beat going into summer. And then for Dragonsteel on the other side, this is a really deflating defeat. Again, this was the team to beat all year long. I had them number 1 in my preseason power rankings, and they never moved in the regular season, regardless of what ended up happening. This team, like this group of players, didn't even drop a game in the regular season as, you know, this version of them. DarkZero Light ended up dropping games, obviously, and even dropped series, but this team, like Zamudo, Spyrex, Sajed, Zyko, they didn't lose a single game in the regular season. They go into playoffs, they look very good in the first couple of rounds, but they can't quite get past Luminosity Gaming. They go down, they barely eke out a win against Conviction, and then they get rolled again here by Luminosity. It's not really a great picture being painted for Dragonsteel, and I think that there are a lot of things to talk about here. Spyrex was just awful today. He's going to get dud of the game once again here for game number 3. He was not good enough. He got mega gapped by Insanity in lane in this matchup. That's really where things ended up going wrong. Insanity was obviously great in the team fights as well, and Spyrex made his own set of mistakes, especially on the Tristana just jumping in without the rest of his team, but really where the big problems came in for Spyrex was that he could not survive at all 1v1. It just was not a very good look. He needs to be better than this. He's been better than this. He just won finals MVP for CLOL, you know, in the CLOL championships. And so for him to kind of piggyback off of that performance and immediately go into this series and get blasted by Insanity, it's just a bit of a frustrating look, but we know he can be better. And I think you could say similar things for Zamudo. I'm not sure whether he's going to get a chance to play in Tier 2 again. I don't know anything more than you guys do, but there are a lot of teams that are looking for top laners, and I would not be surprised if he ends up playing in Tier 1 going into next split. If this is his last kind of chance in Tier 2, this is kind of a bad way to say goodbye to the Tier 2 ecosystem, because this was a pretty bad performance. I think he was probably the weakest player in this series. I mean, him or Spyrex, right? Both of them ended up getting destroyed, but it just wasn't a great look. There were moments in this game number 3 where he was okay, but overall it just wasn't all that ideal. Sajed and Zyko were not the problem, but they also were not the solution in this one. They were still outclassed by Tactical and Zeyzal, and that can't really be acceptable. And Kryra was probably the best player on the team in this series. He was at the very least attempting to try to make plays here. It just was not working out at all for him, especially when you're going to play things like Maokai and Sejuani. Like, it's all well and good to be the strongest player on the Rift or the most active player on the Rift and sacrifice resources to get your laners into a good spot on these champions. If your laners don't do anything with it, it doesn't actually matter. So overall for DarkZero, it's back to the drawing board. Again, losing this, winning this, it's not all that important in terms of how things go moving into summer. It's more for Pride than anything, but Pride has been acquired. Luminosity is the team to beat, and right now, when you look at their standing, when you look at the way that they play the game, and you even look at a team like Disguised up in the LTA, you know, there is a lot of things that you can point to say that this might be a team that's representing the NACL, representing Tier 2 as the representative in the guest spot next year. All right, but that is going to do it for my NACL Finals overview and analysis video here in the spring playoffs, and that's going to do it for my NACL coverage this split. The spring split is done and dusted. You can see up on the screen. Congratulations to Luminosity Gaming, your official spring split champions here in the NACL. They absolutely earned it. They were fantastic across this entire split. Their only loss coming to DarkZero early on with Yuji, a player who's now performing in the LTA. It goes to show show just how strong this team is and how much they've even leveled up. Again, their macro is incredible. I think their flexibility is incredible, and they have earned this championship opportunity by destroying the finals. Now it's about repeating that performance, because as nice as it is to be able to hold up the trophy here in spring, it's all about summer now for these teams. Of course, the next thing here in the NACL is the promotion relegation tournament. Moving into the summer split, our bottom two teams, Apex, Mission Impossible, and Polestar, are going to be participating there alongside a couple of very interesting OQ teams. I'm not sure I'm going to cover it on the channel. We've never covered the promotion tournament in the past just because it sometimes overlaps with some major international tournaments. I will keep you guys posted on that in terms of my Twitter, which you can see down in the description below, as well as the channel posts on this channel itself. But I really do appreciate if you guys have enjoyed the NACL videos, and it does mean a lot to me that you guys tune in. I really do, put a lot of effort and a lot of time into watching every single game, and the NACL, as you guys know, is really a passion project. We don't always get the most views on this video, but I know the community really, should be bolstered in this kind of way. It's a league that I really want to cover. I don't cover it because I have to, I cover it because I want to, and honestly, they make it worth it every single year. These are some of the most fun games, some of the most fun storylines, and some of the most fun players in the entire world. So I appreciate you guys sticking around, and let me know what you think's gonna happen in the summer split down in the comment section below. But that's gonna do it for today's video. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're done with the NACL, at least for this split, but we're covering it in the summer, and we also still cover all 4 of the major regions as well. So LTA North, LEC, LCK, and LPL. Their playoffs are all ongoing, and we've covered all of the start of them at the very least on this channel. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL esports, especially with something like MSI just around the corner, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.